Sustainability is a word we hear applied mostly to the environment or energy these days, but you can also use it in terms of finance. And INSEAD economics professor Antonio Fatas was recently asked by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors to come down to Washington and talk to them about fiscal sustainability. Thank you very much for being with us, Antonio.
Thank you.
What was on the agenda of the meeting, and actually who was there?
So this was a meeting where the Board of Governors was asking a few academics, and I was invited as one of the academics that they invited to this panel to talk about issues of fiscal policy sustainability in the US, but also in other advanced economies. And the question is, how could governments manage going forward the high levels of government debt that they've accumulated in the past? And also given that in the future, they're likely to have even more pressure on their budgets because of increasing spending in the form of either healthcare or pensions. And the tone of the meeting, to be honest, was fairly pessimistic. I was hoping that someone would come up with some optimistic scenarios that maybe I myself could become a little bit more optimistic. But I think at the end of the meeting, there was a lot of bad news that we all shared together, and a sense at the end that something major has to happen to achieve fiscal sustainability in many of these advanced economies.
I mean, the easiest ways to cut expenses and raise taxes or raise revenues in some way. Was there something other than that discussed? What was needed?
I think at the end of the day, governments have to balance their budgets as you or I or a company has to balance their accounts. And it's clearly they need more revenues and they need to cut their spending, or a combination of both. I think what we were trying to understand is there a way to do that it will be less harmful to the economy, that will be easier from a political point of view. At this point, I don't think there are any concrete policy proposals on the table. I think there has to be in the US over time an increase in the tax revenue. And there's a discussion of whether to introduce a VAT, a value-added tax system like the Europeans and other countries have. Now, as an economist, my argument would be that that's probably the most efficient way to go. That's one of the most efficient taxes that you can raise. Now, from a political point of view, it will raise, like any other tax, it will raise lots of questions. But that could be a potential solution going forward. So you don't want to tax labor, you don't want to tax investment, because you want economic growth to be as healthy as possible. So you want to tax consumption, which is what the VAT does. Now, the VAT in European countries has been established for many years. It's working very well. Now, if you start from zero in the US, first you're going to have the political opposition to raising taxes, which is going to be true to any form of taxes. And then there's this question, which is maybe the VAT will introduce first lots of bureaucratic steps to be able to collect the taxes. But also, given that it might be a very efficient way of raising revenues, some fear that that would be a source of future revenues for governments so that they will come out with new ideas to spend more money.
How attractive is the U.S., however, as a seller of debt? I noticed that the Federal Reserve just left rates at practically zero, and they said they'd do that for a long time.
This is something that came out in the meeting. The U.S. is in a privileged position because so far they've had absolutely no trouble. The U.S. government has had no trouble raising money to finance their debt and their deficits. And still the interest rates that the Federal Reserve has set or the interest rate that the U.S. government faces are extremely low by historical standards. Now, this is the biggest fear. The biggest fear is that the U.S. turns into a scenario which is similar to the one Greece and other European countries are seeing today, where the moment interest rates are coming up, then your budget constraint becomes even much worse, and meeting your budget balance is very much impossible. Now, is that a scenario that is likely to happen in the short term? I don't think so, and I don't think anyone was pessimistic about that, but it's something that one has to consider, which is the only reason why the U.S. so far has not run into trouble is because of the fact that the rest of the world has been willing to lend them money at a very low rate.
There has not been a lot of consensus in the U.S. for several years politically. Was this discussed at all? I mean, were people concerned about this?
What you would like to have is to have an environment where there's a lot of political consensus, where both parties or whatever number of political parties you have in a country agree on a certain set of measures that everyone feels are the only way forward. Now, my sense is that's not going to happen in the U.S. in the coming quarter, in the coming years, which means that there's a fear that the adjustment will be postponed, which might be okay, might not be the end of the world, but it just means the adjustment will have to be even larger a few years from now.
What about new sources of revenue? Everybody talks about innovation and entrepreneurship, and quite frankly, the U.S. has been pretty good about starting entire new industries. Was that discussed, and are you optimistic that there might be new sources?
The type of revenues the U.S. government needs to raise will not be generated by an increase in productivity or increase in growth. I mean, if that happens, that will make things easier. but you need cuts in spending and increases in taxes, even if we see a miracle like what we see in the 90s.
Where would cuts be?
The biggest source of an imbalance is healthcare cost. If healthcare costs are kept grow at a rate which is below GDP growth, things will be fine. But the problem is that we all assume, given what we've seen in the last decades, that healthcare cost is going to grow much faster than GDP growth.
Even with the new bill that was just passed?
Even with the new bill, even if I think there is some hope that obviously costs will be contained, there's still a scenario where healthcare costs will naturally grow faster than GDP growth. And if that's the case, then there is a big imbalance in the government accounts.
Europe is arguably at least in as bad shape as the U.S. in terms of debt. And they've had other scenarios similar to this. There doesn't seem to be the same level of concern.
I think what makes the difference here is that Europe has been dealing with this, I think, for decades now. While in the U.S., I think this comes as a surprise. I think, again, 10 years ago, there was a sense that there was no issue with government debt. And now one day you wake up, there's a big recession, government debt spikes up, and then you look at the future and it looks even worse. So I think it's a question of contrast. While Europe is more used to it, I think for the US this is new. And given the current political environment, it's not easy to deal with this new element in the economic and political debate, for which we don't have an easy solution.
Finally, let me ask you what you see in your crystal ball for maybe the next 3 to 5 years in the US, and maybe how that might impact other countries that are either lending money or coexisting with the US.
In the very short term, the U.S. can handle the current levels of government debt and government deficit. There's nothing that would call for an immediate crisis. I think would happen at some point in the medium term, there would be a little bit of a crisis of confidence in the U.S. government, probably at a time where the economy is doing better and investors find opportunities outside of U.S. government bonds. Then the U.S. government will see their interest rate going up. And at some point, that might turn into a mini crisis where the government realizes that you need immediate action. Now, my hope is that at that point, from a political point of view, there's a way to reach consensus so a solution can be found.
Great. Thank you very much, Antonio Fatas.
Thank you. Pleasure.